Hello, this is Salon George from the blog spirituallivingforbusypeople.com. And it's 3 o'clock Eastern and doing a live stream today. I called it Preparing for the Unpreparable, a conversation about death. And so I will wait for a minute or two to see if we have a few more people joining on. But regardless, I will press forward and speak. But I'll just give it a minute or two. So welcome for those of you who are watching live. Welcome to those of you who will watch this later. For those of you who are here, I hope you can hear me. If there are any problems, you can let me know, but hopefully you can hear me just fine. Welcome, Kenya. Hi. Where are you from? So we may have lost you, hopefully not, but I know in this time of greater internet usage, we've all discovered the wonders of the internet. Sometimes our connections may not be as strong as they need to be because we're all using up bandwidth. Detroit, Michigan. Why the sad face? Welcome from Detroit. So anyways, I know we're using up a lot of bandwidth here. So hopefully your internet connections are strong. Hopefully mine will stay strong. I'm looking at the router, well, hopefully it's not too awful where you are, Kenya, and hopefully we can make it better. I know we're going to be discussing a pretty heavy subject today, but I hope by the end of this, you'll feel more hopeful. So the goal isn't to make this super heavy, even though I'll be sharing about some pretty heavy subjects. Obviously, we're talking about death, especially in a time of pandemic. But the idea is to have us leave with feeling more in control, even in a time where we feel like we don't have control. We can even be able to prepare for things that we can't even contemplate at this time, which is death and dying. So I want to start, though, before I launch into anything, I love doing just a little centering exercise. Again, I know we're all feeling pretty anxious out there. So I'd like to just start with some centering, and then I'm going to read a blessing. It's a little lengthy, but I really think that we can all benefit from this. And so I will read it. I'll tell you where it's coming from in a minute. But let's just take a minute and just take a couple breaths. You can close your eyes if that helps you. You can breathe in through the nostrils and out through the mouth. Nice deep breath. So in my other life, I'm a choir director, and I always have my singers do a little bit of breathing before we sing. And I always say, we breathe into our diaphragm. So when we breathe in, our shoulders, we're not going to be breathing like this. We're breathing, and our tummy should expand. And then when we breathe out, just try to exhale everything, keeping the shoulders nice and level and relaxed, and trying to breathe out all the air. And then you take another breath, try to breathe in even deeper, and then out again. It's wonderful that we have this little simple exercise of breathing. We're breathing every moment, but hi, Eva, welcome back. We're breathing every moment, but we're seldom even aware of our breathing. And what all of this is doing is helping us to slow down so that we can become aware of our breath. Just doing that alone is hugely helpful. So I'd like to continue this centering time with, I'm going to read, and I have some writings that I have right here, so I'll be looking down a bit. I took some notes as I was thinking of what I was going to talk about, and I took like 6 pages of notes. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to hit everything that came to my head, but I wanted to be guided by some notes here as I share with you, still from my heart, but kind of giving myself a little guidance. So if I look down to look at my notes, please bear with me. So I'm going to read a blessing. This is called A Blessing for One Who is Exhausted. And this is by John O'Donohue. John O'Donohue was an Irish writer. I should have looked this up better, but if you look him up, you will find him. He's been a real source of comfort and inspiration for me ever since I discovered his writings months ago. He's since died a number of years ago, but his writings continue to inspire many people, especially at this time. So this blessing comes from a book called To Bless the Space Between Us, a book of blessings. And again, it's by John O'Donohue. If you like this blessing, I encourage you to get the book. It's very good. A blessing for one who is exhausted. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unattended stress falls on the mind like an endless increasing weight. The light in the mind becomes dim. Things you could take in your stride before now become laborsome events of will. Weariness invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There is nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you have forsaken for race of days. At first, your thinking will darken and sadness take over like listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You have traveled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. Take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the way of rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight. Take time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. Amen. I love that. And I hope that helped you. It speaks so much to what we're going through, but also to the opportunities that we have to enter slow time. There's so many phrases in there that I love. So here we go. So imagine for a moment that you are in a village, you live in a village, and suddenly this village is invaded by this invisible illness that in short order wipes out half the population, let's say 50 to 60% of the population. Imagine that people who were once your friends and neighbors are now abandoning each other due to their sheer panic of this plague, of this illness. Imagine priests and clergy refusing to offer blessings and caring for the sick. Imagine people running from the village into the woods to isolate themselves and cut themselves off, even from family and their children, in order to escape death. But they know that it's only a matter of time before they too are struck down. So this is a reality that people in the Middle Ages faced during an awful pandemic, the bubonic plague, which is more commonly known as the Black Death. And this was so horrific, so terrible, so swift, that it was said that people would wake up feeling fine in the morning, ill by noon, and dead by evening. Europe experienced waves and waves of pandemic through the next 100 years, coming from the East, from Asia. And people of these times and our ancestors of earlier times and earlier pandemics were very aware of death, of how it surrounded them, of how they experienced it in very real and terrible ways. We, in our modern time, have been very fortunate for the most part. So even though we've had a few outbreaks in recent years, SARS and so on, and even plague, every few years, every year I think we hear of a few cases, but now we have modern medicine that can help us for the most part with something like the plague if it's caught early enough. So we have medicine, modern medicine, that has helped us improve our lives and our health. So we live longer. We also have, again, in the course of history, the birth of the funeral industry, which allowed us to move the caring for our sick and dying and dead, our beloved dead from the home to a funeral home. That meant that we were able to kind of remove the reality of death in some way, even though we clearly had to experience it, but we could somehow be removed from it. So we have modern medicine, very few plagues or any widespread outbreaks. We live longer. So we could very easily think that death is something that is of no concern to us, that death is something for other people. Other people die. But the reality is that we'll all die, each and every one of us. And I know that that's something you all know. So I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence here. It's something we all know on one level. All right. So on the mental level, on the intellectual level, it's something that we all know. But on an emotional level, spiritual level, it's a very different story. It can be very difficult to come to terms with that reality. What's even more difficult, and I help people who are dying as a chaplain. And this is where someone like me can be very beneficial because a person may be dealing with terminal illness, but having to wrestle with the realization that they're actually dying. And that's a very difficult process. And often you need the support of others to help you. And that's where someone like me would come in, a chaplain. But this is something I see every day. People are struggling to accept the reality of death, that they themselves are dying. And I'll be honest with you, even though I get to do this work every day, I can't sit here and tell you and guarantee to you that when my time comes that I'll be calm and ready, and I'll probably be freaking out like everybody else, because it is very difficult for us to contemplate our own deaths. So now we're living in a time, this pandemic, right, where we feel like death is around us. Clearly, we're not to the awfulness that happened during the Black Death, where so many people were dying so quickly that they just could not keep up. And I won't get into into gory details here, but you can probably have a sense of what that meant for the people in towns and villages and cities with large population centers, Italy, which was not really Italy at that time, but those city states. And it's interesting because Italy has suffered so much now in this pandemic. So I'm sure for Italy, and actually for all of us around the world, people are now really thinking back to the times of past plagues, of past pandemics, including the Black Death, and now realizing that, you know, the Black Death, the experience of the Black Death, isn't so academic anymore. That that what happened in the past is kind of happening again. Again, not to the same intensity, but we're certainly seeing, you know, the death rates go up every single day. And so we know that death is around us. Never mind people who are dying of other, you know, people, many millions of people who die every day from other causes. But because we're in this heightened state of focus on the pandemic, these deaths are really showing up, I think, for us in a different way. And so we're having to deal with death in a way that we may not be used to or comfortable with. I think what's particularly cruel about this pandemic, as with the Black Death and probably pandemics of the past, is, you know, some people may be dying alone because we're being forced to separate from one another. I've been working with some families who are grappling with not being able to visit their loved ones who are dying, and I've had to bring comfort and guidance and support to some families who are facing this. So this is very real, and I'm seeing some of it. I'm not seeing all of it, but I'm certainly having to deal with some of it myself in my work. People are feeling separate at a time when they need each other more than ever, and people at this time of life need physical presence, a physical touch. We're not able to touch each other. We're not able to be close to each other physically. We're not able to offer that kind of comfort. Obviously, we're trying to offer it in other ways, distance, either at a, you know, being at a distance from someone, or doing it, or families doing it in other ways, or via Skype or other technology. So at least something is better than nothing, but it's certainly a challenge for a lot of families. I think too, the part that's very challenging is we don't know how much worse this will get before it gets better. And we don't know how long it will last. So the duration and the intensity are both things that are very uncertain, and we just don't know how far this will go. And I think that creates a sense of dread, like what's going to happen tomorrow. We know that the United States now is one of the epicenters of this. So if you're in the United States, you're probably feeling more anxious. If you're viewing this from other parts of the world, I mean, I don't think there's any part of the world that is untouched by this, because even if death rates are low where you are, I think governments are responding in very drastic ways. So you're seeing and feeling the effects of that, you know, death toll rising. So we have a sense now of death. In our everyday language, we speak of death as if it's optional. If I die. But now I think we're faced, really with an opportunity. So again, I'm going to try to turn this into an opportunity. As I, had done in my first broadcast, we can see even this as an opportunity, not something as morbid, but an opportunity to begin to face this reality and to be able to start preparing for it. And realizing that in the act of preparing for the unpreparable, which is kind of an oxymoron, but there are ways we can prepare. We don't know what it's like to die. All right. We don't know what it's like to die. Our beloved dead don't come back and tell us what it was like to make it all the way through to death. We do have near-death stories, people who go to the brink and come back. And some of these stories can be very, very hopeful. I've heard lots of them, and they always, I've heard first-person accounts in my work. And no matter how many times I've heard, they tend to have very similar stories. But it always gives me goosebumps when I hear stories like that. But that's the best we can do. We have kind of near-death stories, but we don't have the dead actually coming back and telling us. So we really don't know until we go there. And when we go there, we can't come back and share. So so that's why I call it the unpreparable, right? And I'm not sure if that's a word, but that's okay. So we are being forced to prepare for something that is inherently something that we just don't know what it's going to be like. But I'm going to share that there are things that we can do to help us approach the end of life with a sense of peace, calmness. And again, I've seen people do this, so I know it's possible. And wherever I can, I've tried to help people do this as well. So I'll talk a little bit about my hospice work and what that looks like normally. So normally, and I think I shared in my first or second broadcast, most families, thank you for joining, Kathy Jo. And yes, I'm glad you can hear. I'm glad you're listening. And I'll have a time for people to share questions or thoughts or comments. So most of my time is spent listening to people share stories, joys, concerns, fears, mostly concerns for their families and friends, people who they love and care about. Another big part of that work is helping people come to terms with the fact that they're dying or that they might be dying. And a lot of that is having conversations with them, usually led by them. So I don't try to make people talk about things that they don't want to talk about. But things may come up that provides an opportunity to ask, to help people to process what their fears are around dying. And, this is very delicate work that is often done over a long period of time, ideally over a few weeks or months, where you build trust and rapport with the patient and with the family, and they begin to trust you enough to share what their concerns are about dying, whether they are afraid of the pain of dying, or just not being here, or just being in the ground. Whatever fears that they have, they can feel safe just verbalizing those fears, sometimes for the very first time. But also talking about practical concerns. And so this is where other members of our hospice team become very critical. So the nurse and the social worker, we are kind of, core team. And the social worker can help with some practical concerns, but sometimes those conversations begin with the chaplain, and then it can seamlessly move toward the social worker helping families with practical matters, like healthcare proxies and wills and what kind of setting you want to be in. Do you want to be in the home? Do you want to be in some nursing facility? Do you want to be hospitalized or not? What types of medications? All these very practical concerns that often people are having to grapple with right there and then, because, as I said before, we have a very hard time having these conversations before the time comes. It can make things more difficult, but it is possible to be dealing with those in real time. But it's always better if those conversations can happen before illness hits, before some crisis hits. But we are there with our families every step of the way. So regardless of where they are in the process, we're trying to help them from where they are to where they want to be, right? So what their goals are. So this is not about us trying to get them to a place where we want to be. We want to find out what their goals are and then help them get there. For most people who come on hospice, they want to die at home. But the reason why I mentioned this, right, this long, very, very delicate process of helping people to make that journey, especially as their illness progresses and they become weaker and they gradually become bedbound, trying to process all of that. Imagine in a situation like a pandemic, right? Having to truncate all of that. So now we're dealing with families having to face these questions in the blink of an eye. Someone who was perfectly healthy goes to being deathly ill, dying, and having to have conversations with physicians, doctors, about all of these things I mentioned within a very short space of time. So there's very little time for reflecting and really sharing. I mean, again, I think it can be done, but it's a much greater challenge when you're in an emergency kind of setting, to be able to provide space for a person to share what their feelings are as they progress through this. So it can be very very difficult to navigate that in times of crisis. Certainly, during every plague, during the plague that I mentioned, this is what was happening. People were suddenly having to write wills and deal with that in real time. So families are having to face that right now. Again, as I'd mentioned, families are having to face doing this in isolation. So they're having these conversations, but not being able to do it together. And so this makes the process so much more difficult. Again, not impossible. So I think our goal, people who are on the front lines, I know the types of people who do this work, they will do their very, very best to help families as best as they can. So there's a book that I want to, and there was a passage from, yes, here it is. So there's a book I want to share. This book is, it's called Hard Choices for Loving People. And it's written by a fellow hospice chaplain named Hank Dunn. Hank Dunn. And I want to share just a little passage that he writes here. And he calls it Hard Choices for Loving People. So some of the things I mentioned, the hard choices of, I haven't even mentioned all of them. And this broadcast really isn't to get into a lot of detail into that, but these are things that you can research and talk to people who are very qualified about. But living wills, feeding tubes, hospitalization. What are the things that you want when you are facing the end of your life? Not if, okay, but when. So these conversations, these hard choices that we all have to make, and hopefully that we have a chance to make sooner than later. He writes this. He said, "What really makes these decisions, hard choices, quote unquote, has little to do with the medical, legal, ethical, or moral aspects of the decision process. The real struggles are emotional and spiritual. And I've certainly, again, in my experience, have found that to be true. Um, and so this is deep inner work, right? So when we talk about spiritual, and I know spiritual is a kind of a nebulous word it's very hard to kind of pin down, right? But I see it mostly as kind of matters of the heart, and the kind of invisible, less practical things that we have to deal with, like feelings and emotions. Those become, believe it or not, those become very important when we're dealing with things like this. Because not only are we making choices, but we're having feelings as we're making those choices. We're having feelings or emotions that may be causing us to avoid making certain choices. So when we talk about spiritual, at least this is just me. I think you may hear different answers from different people, but it's really just getting down to inner life. What is the inner life of the person? Inner life meaning feelings, emotions, beliefs, thoughts, all those things, right? All of those squishy things, less practical things, become very important, becoming in tune with what we're feeling, why we're feeling, acting even when we feel a certain way. These are spiritual concerns. Obviously, within that category of spiritual comes religious beliefs. So what are your beliefs? What informs your beliefs? What's meaningful for you? What are your beliefs about afterlife, the afterlife? What happens after you die? So what a person thinks about what happens to them after they die may cause them to have certain feelings about that, about dying and the process of dying. So it is a spiritual, mostly spiritual thing. And what I just read from his book, I feel has borne out in my experience as a chaplain. So, families are facing a lot. I mean, I didn't even mention, funerals. Many funerals are on hold. So, and again, I'm having to deal with this. I'm seeing this every day. As patients die, they're not able to have a regular type of funeral. They may have a very small service that is very restricted, so they can't have very many people there. All the people who they love, you usually get hugs and all that stuff. That's just not there. Or they're having to postpone until an unknown date. And that the prospect of that for some people is just a lot to bear. I was talking to a person recently who said, imagine having to reopen that wound, so to speak, of grief months down the road, to have to go do a service months down the road. So the pain that people are experiencing is very real. And I want to just touch on something else too before I kind of get into ways that we can approach talking about death that can be helpful. But I want to be mindful as well of people who are struggling emotionally from all this, people who are already depressed and anxious. We know that in our modern world, the biggest threat to life, one of the biggest threats to life, is ourselves. So we went from having a society where the biggest threat were, disease and famine and war, and we were able to, through modern technologies, solve a lot of those problems. But now the problems have become problems of the spirit, matters of heart. And we know that suicide has been on the rise for many years now. And so, we've become more isolated, alone as a society, and rates of suicide has gone up. I don't have any numbers in front of me. I haven't really looked at suicide stats, but I have to think that the threat of suicide will probably go up. I've heard a few stories anecdotally, but I don't have evidence for that. But my mind are on people who are already struggling, and may have thoughts of suicide, because dealing with this crisis is so difficult. So I wanna to just to have us keep that in mind, to be mindful of our neighbors and friends who may be vulnerable in that way, and to reach out and provide support in whatever way we can. If anyone here by any chance is struggling with that, I would encourage you to reach out for support. Even though we can't quite reach out physically, we can still make a phone call. I know in the United States, we have, the suicide prevention hotline. And I wrote down the number here, even 1-800-273-8255 is the number, but you can always do a quick search online. If you're watching this from some other part of the world, look up who your local supports are, national and local supports are. But I want us to be thinking about our friends and neighbors, and even ourselves, and be watching and guarding for that. Because it's something that can creep up. On a related note to that, I want to touch on something that I heard someone say to me, and it's been sticking with me. So I want to just mention it and throw it out there. And I know kind of the ship has kind of sailed with this, but I want to put it out there. The term that we've been using, it's become a real buzzword, social distancing. So I talked to someone recently who was saying to me, it's really difficult for this person to have to hear that term, because this is a person who's struggling with anxiety and depression, and the idea of distancing from others is very scary, because they've always been told, seek others out, and now we're saying, practice social distancing. Obviously, what we're practicing in reality is physical distancing. So that's what we absolutely have to practice, right? So we have to practice, being at least 6 feet from each other, trying not to be in large groups, staying in our homes unless we have to go do important errands. So all the things that are on the CDC, by the way, and I would encourage people to visit, see the CDC website as a reputable source for information. But all of those guidelines, right? What we're talking about is physical distancing. But by no means does that mean that we have to shut down socially. So obviously, again, the horses are out of the barn with this already. The term is social distancing, right? But when you hear social distancing, I want you to think physical distancing. And if this is something that you think might be helpful to someone to share with them, I would encourage you to share it. So again, I want to be clear that we're not saying that we don't want to practice those guidelines of not congregating in large groups. We absolutely need to do that to stay safe and to keep others safe. But we don't need to distance ourselves from each other socially. And that's a big part of why I'm here, and why so many people are using technologies to be able to connect socially. We can still do that. It's not perfect. It's not quite the same. And again, in my line of work, offering loving and kind words to someone at a distance is not the same as doing it close up and giving them a hug, or if they allow, or a pat on the back if they allow, right? These are important ways that we help one another through our presence and touch. So I know this is not a small thing to be able to separate, to have to separate physically, but we can still, in the best way we can, convey that sense virtually, or even physically, but at a distance from one another. So, you may be thinking about a friend or a neighbor who may be having a hard time, and a phone call would be just fine, a text even, or if this is someone who doesn't have the internet, someone who may not even have a phone, maybe I've heard people say things like maybe visiting them, but staying outside, and they can stay inside, and at least they can see you. They know that you're there. They know that you're thinking of them. If they need groceries, and you're able to do that, you can pick up a few things for them, drop it off at the front door or whatever. But it just lets us know that we're still social beings. We're still thinking of each other, caring for each other. So we're not shutting down socially. So anyways, I wanted to just mention that. Physical distancing versus social distancing. I know that the term social distancing will not go away, and I don't want to cause any confusion about that either. But just think physical distancing instead of social distancing. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's clear. So the question is, knowing that you will die, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. How can you take this opportunity to prepare for that? I would say the first thing is to just begin having conversations, open conversation with people, with the people closest to you about what you want and what matters to you. So before I started doing hospice chaplaincy, I was in college chaplaincy, and I never thought that I would be doing hospice chaplaincy. I loved being in the college setting. That's what I wanted to do. I never wanted to be in a hospital setting. I never wanted to work with the dying, because it was just something that I was afraid of, like many people. So when I talk about people, not talking about death and dying, I'm not judging anyone. I was, and in some ways, I would say firmly in that category. No one likes talking about the end of life. Not even me, who does this every day. So, but before I was in hospice chaplaincy, I remember, so my wife is a nurse, and she has been comfortable with death long before I became more comfortable with talking about death. And I remember early in our marriage, she would just have conversations with me, telling me what she wants and what she wants at the end of life. And I would always shut her down and try to end the conversation as quickly as I could, because I just didn't want to talk about it. But now, fast forward all these years later, we have come up with a living will. So there was a lot of work in between this, me being able to talk about death and to have real conversation with my wife about that. But it is possible. And, the way we approach each other is important. So to just come right out and say, here's what I want, blah, 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 right? It might not be the best way. You know your spouse best, you know your loved one best. So you can think of ways of how to approach a person and sharing about what your goals are, what you're thinking of, hopefully in a way that is not too much or too frightening. And it takes time. So it may take a little bit of time and work. But I would start by just sharing about me and what's important to me, as opposed to trying to say to someone, you have to do this and you have to do that, which I'm not saying my wife did. But I know often conversations can happen like that, where we're trying to get someone to take our point of view. And so we just try to tell them what needs to happen. But the best way is to just begin with yourself. So, and this goes all the way back to becoming present. So if you were with me on my first live stream, I talked about being present with ourselves. So this inner work, right? This inner work of dealing with hard choices, it starts with our own inner work. So I would begin, actually, before talking to a loved one, begin with yourself. Get a pen and pad and just write down, first of all, what your feelings are when you think about death. Is it fear? Is it concern for others? Is it fear of pain? Is it fear of what comes next? Is it the fear of just not being here, just not being able to contemplate that, just not being here? What is it? It could be, and it doesn't have to be all negative too. Some people may think of it as a release, from this life, that is positive. Again, this all depends on what people's beliefs are about what happens after this life. And of course, we're talking about a healthy setting here, so we're not talking about suicide or thoughts of taking one's own life, but just thinking, yeah, when it's over, it's over, and that's great. And I talk to people like that, people who say they have no fears of dying, they've had a good life, and so it's okay when the time comes. So you can start kind of getting very attuned with where you fall in that spectrum, from full acceptance, it's going to be okay, I'm fine with it, to I'm completely terrified, I don't even want to think about it, even talking about it makes me just feel nauseous, I'll do anything to avoid it. Where are you on that spectrum? So I would start with that, and then I would continue with beginning to investigate what are some things you need to be thinking about. So I've mentioned a few in passing, and again, I think if I get very bogged down in all the details of this will go on forever. But I think most of you here, can do research into end of life considerations. So, and I'd mentioned a few, but wills, DNR, most forms. These are things that these are documents, medical documents that spell out what a person want or don't want at the end of life. Do you want life-sustaining treatment at all costs? Or is there a point where you will decide, I would like to end life-sustaining treatment at this point? And by the way, this is something that, depending on where you are in your life, may change. So if we're talking about a 20-year-old, it's very different from a person who is middle-aged or beyond. So these things, by the way, aren't set in stone. So you making a decision or determination now doesn't mean that you're stuck with that for the rest of your life. You will see that as you change, as your life changes, you'll have to go back into these documents and update them. But you may be thinking just on a more. So I'm going to talk more on a more general level and less detailed. But you may be having thoughts of, where do I want to be? What setting do I want to be in when I'm dying? Do I want to be in a hospital somewhere, or do I want to be at home surrounded by friends and family? Again, this will all depend on what's happening, right? If a person is in an accident, then they go to the hospital, right? But if a person has some terminal illness that unfolds over time, then they can get to decide where they want to be. Who do you want around you? Do you want a space that is quiet, or are you okay with friends and family? And again, this is in normal times, not now, but in normal times, are you okay with friends and family gathering and laughing and talking and sharing? There are some people who are, believe it or not, some people who may be dying and they're happy to have family just gathered and talking around them. Obviously, right now, that's not something that would be possible, but families can do that virtually. What sounds do you want? Some people have music lists, music that they would like to hear. I had one patient, and I'll never forget this patient. As many others, there are many people who have come into my life, many of my patients who I'll never forget. But this one in particular had a music list that was playing, and you entered the space, and this music was so peaceful. Um, and I was just struck and touched by how intentional this person was, who knew they were approaching the end of their life and had this plan in place, down to what music they wanted to hear at that time. Some people don't want anything at all, no music, right? But for this person, this was important. So you have a chance to decide and determine what's meaningful for you, what's most meaningful, what do you want, who do you want, where do you want to be, what kind of environment do you want to be in. So those are kind of high level, less detailed questions that you can begin entertaining and thinking about, and then you can get into the more detailed questions about, Moltz forms and DNR forms, and wills and so on, and even caregivers. Determining who caregivers would be, determining what kind of financial resources that you may have to have private hire people come into the home to care for you if you're going to be at home. From determining if you have an illness, when you will go from active treatment to ending active treatment and moving into palliative care or hospice setting. So those are kind of more nitty-gritty things that you can be thinking of as well. And then, you've had some time to process and think about these things. Then, I would say, in approaching a conversation with a loved one, is to ask permission first, to say, there are some things I want to share, and I would like to know when would be a good time for me to bring this up. Is now a good time? If now is not a good time, maybe they'll say no, and they say, let's talk about it tomorrow. Let's talk about it, and you say, okay. And then you come back and you share what you've been processing in your own life, in yourself, about the end of life, what your feelings are and what things you would want, and begin the conversation that way, and hopefully open up to having kind of mutual sharing back and forth about what each of you would want. If you're a couple, a married couple, or a family, parent, child, a parent who maybe at the end of life talking to their kids about what they would like to have. But again, these conversations under normal circumstances isn't just a one-off thing, right? So it would unfold over time. So you may start the conversation by sharing your feelings, giving them a chance to share their feelings, and then progress in the conversation to more practical matters. So that's just, again, for me, just off the top of my head, kind of sharing from my heart a way that a person can approach this. But this could be very different for you based on your own personal circumstance. But the point of this discussion isn't to give you a specific template to follow. I think is to give you space to consider what your own process will be, is to encourage you to begin opening up, to start thinking about, how would you approach this? How would you talk to loved ones about this? What choices will you make? What are your questions? The goal of this is to really open that up for you so that you can make the best choices for yourself and for your family. So it's already 54 minutes. I've been going almost an hour. I'm always amazed by that, of how quickly the time goes. So before I kind of continue to the last part of this, I want to pause for a minute, because I know I've said kind of a lot of things, and I want to give any of you here with me live a chance to share thoughts or questions, concerns, or if you need clarification on anything I talked about that didn't make a lot of sense to you. You can type it into the chat box, which I hope you can find. My chat box is on the right side of the screen. And if you don't see it, there may be something that you need to click on for it to drop down. But hopefully you have your chat boxes. And if you want to share a comment, a question, a thought, feel free. So I'll take a pause. I'll take a drink of water because I've been talking for almost an hour. So Eva asks, so do you remember the song I specifically requested you sing? Yes, I do remember. And if you want me to share it, I could. But yes, I do remember. So I know that my friend Eva, I know you've had these conversations, and some of them with me, which is wonderful. So yeah, I mean, planning funeral services, and again, we're in a time. Can you sing it? I'll probably do some singing at some point in these broadcasts. What was I saying? Funerals, planning funerals. That's something that I know a lot of. I speak to many people about this, and almost 100%. I mean, when people say to me, my mom and dad, they planned their funeral many years ago, you can feel a sense of like relief and release, that they don't have to be concerned about that, because they're already dealing with so much grief, anticipatory grief. We call it anticipatory grief, meaning grieving already in anticipation of what's to come. We know, they know that their mom and dad are going to die, and just wrestling with that alone is enough. Imagine having to deal with all these, practical. Again, it can be done, and there's no judgment for that. But I know that in walking with people through this, it can be very difficult to be dealing with funeral homes and dealing with planning a service and asking mom and dad, what do you want? But at that moment in time, they're too weak to tell you what they want. By that time, they're weak, or they may be confused. They may not have the presence of mind to even tell you what they want in that moment. So, siblings may be fighting over plans because one set of the family has one idea of what they want, and another set have their idea, and so families are left to kind of duke it out. So I have a number of families who, when they say that to me, you can feel a weight off their shoulders. The funeral was planned, the songs were planned, the service was planned, the plot paid for, this is all done, and so they feel like they can fully be present with mom or dad with that grief that they have. And it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a hard thing, but it's beautiful to see when it's done that way. Obviously, when it's not, then we as a team, we try to assist with that. That's a big part of why we're there. So we're honored to help people who aren't quite there yet. And when they allow a hospice team in, then we have that opportunity to help them. But there are so many other people who don't have anyone, and they're left to just grapple with this all by themselves. And again, we're talking about death in a time of pandemic and crisis. I think that's what a lot of people are facing. So, yes, it's so much easier and less stressful on everyone to do this ahead of time. I can testify to that 100%. And again, just my experience walking with people. And again, I don't say this to disparage people who don't plan or to judge them. We love them just the same, and we care for them just the same, and we try to help them as best as we can. And actually, it's a real honor to. It's a real honor to help people in that way. People who are just caught off guard by the reality of death, when they allow us in. And again, the work that they have to do is to allow us in. When they allow us in, we can be very helpful. So I've helped families with funeral plans. They haven't selected the music, they haven't thought of certain things, and so those are things that a team like us or family members or other people in their lives can be helpful with. Let's see. How do you de-stress when you have ministered to someone? you've come to know when they've died? That's a great question. And it's a question that's been asked of me a number of times. And this is where, and actually, I love this question, Eva, because actually, I think the next broadcast I'm going to do is going to be around this topic. So I think this is a perfect thing to kind of close with, unless there are more questions, is self-care. So, and I'm thinking I would like my next broadcast to be about self-care in time of crisis. Self-care is so important. I can tell you 100%, if I am not caring for myself in real tangible ways, I will burn out. People burn out. This is not easy work. So what are some ways that I de-stress personally? I love to read. I love, just coming home to my family, as stressful as that could be sometimes, coming to a household of many kids. But being able to come home to a loving family is very filling for me. So I can tell you some of the things I do specifically, just to answer your question. At the end of my day, I make sure I have a kind of ritual. So, and this might sound small and silly, but it works for me. I turn off my phone, and I make a little ritual of it. After I've finished my visits, I've done my charting. We have to chart on the computer. I chart my visits, and then I turn my computer off. I close it in a very intentional way. Then I take my phone, my work issued phone, so not my personal phone, but my work issued phone. That I'm usually on all day, emailing or getting phone calls, and I take a breath and I turn it off. So that's the first step of my self-care, is that I put a pretty, I wouldn't say like super hot, I put a fairly firm boundary between my home and my work life. It's a little tougher now with the crisis, honestly, because of all that's going on. But in normal times, I put a firm boundary that I do no work at home. I do no charting at home. I don't look at my computer at home. Now, I've had to do that more now because of this crisis. But again, in normal times, that's something I would do. I do still practice that boundary for the most part. But I try not to do any charting in the home, any work at home. When I finish my workday, my phone is off. So I'm not bringing a phone home that is on. So that's huge for me, having that separation, that barrier between home and work life. Now, distress when someone has died. So yes, it's inevitable that we would get attached to the people who we're caring for. These are amazing people. We get to meet amazing people from all walks of life. You get to build a rapport, trust, a relationship with them. Some people, you're considered part of their family. I mean, if I'm making a visit, a couple times a month, sometimes weekly, it's like you become a member of the family. And so when these people die, it can really take a toll. And personally, I have some of the things I've done is personal prayer. So when I struggle emotionally with a death, someone who I've drawn close to, or someone who's died in a traumatic way, someone who died, suddenly, you didn't expect. There are all kinds of weird things that happen. You meet someone and you don't expect. You have a sense of, okay, I'll probably have a few weeks or a few months with this person, and then you wake up the next morning and they died. That can be really, really painful as well. So sometimes you have a long relationship with someone. Sometimes you have just one meeting with a person and you develop this sense of rapport right away, and you're looking forward to the next visit, and they died. It's really tough. So I find a lot of strength in personal prayer. That's big for me. I find a lot of strength in music. I am a musician, So I play, often playing the piano just for myself, and I have a keyboard right here. Playing the piano really helps me to work through those feelings. I don't do a lot of writing or journaling, interestingly, even though I think that could work in certain circumstances if it's really particularly painful. And again, if I'm writing, I would have to be to write very generally because to protect patients' privacy. So really writing about my own feelings and so on. We at hospice, we support each other. So we're a team. And I know I'm taking a long time to answer this question. I apologize. I hope it's doing some good. But we are, so we support one another. Me as the chaplain, I'm there for other team members who struggle. So if they're struggling with a case, with a death, with anything, they can come talk to me. And sometimes I talk to them. So it's a two-way relationship. I have my fellow chaplains who I can turn to, and also we have bereavement support in hospice. So bereavement for families can come again in normal times, can come in and visit with a bereavement counselor. Now the team members can also avail themselves to that. And I've had a couple of times now where I've had to avail myself to that. Each time it's been in a group setting. So where the team, we all kind of have a sense that we're all struggling with a certain death. And so we ask our supervisor to have a gathering. And so we would gather together, we would light a candle, we would have a moment of just calm centering, and then we give each other an opportunity to share. And boy, this sounds so simple, so elementary. It is huge. And it really helps us to process and to get through it so that we can continue to be the professionals we're called to be, right? Because we really can't be taking that into a home, taking that into a setting where we are the ones having to be the rock for the family, for the patient. So it's huge that we can have a space to be vulnerable and supportive of one another. It doesn't mean that we can never be vulnerable with our patients, but it's always there always has to be an awareness of that when we're in the setting, that we are there to support families, not vice versa, right? They shouldn't be comforting us, right? We are there to comfort them, but we in turn can get comfort from others. So that's a really long answer to your question, Eva, but those things are really huge. So I have my own personal self-care things that I do, but also things that I do in community. One of the things that we're doing now, because we're not able to really have groups of meeting. Thank you, Kenya, for coming. Yes, and I'm glad you could be here, and thank you for staying. One of the things that we're doing now is having like Zoom. I think this is something we're just starting, so I haven't had a chance to do this yet. But we're gonna, as a team, start having daily check-ins with one another. And I think these would be like in the form of Zoom calls. So every morning, the team members would have an opportunity to hop on a Zoom call and be of mutual support to one another. Again, in times of crisis, bye-bye. Bye, Kenya. Again, thank you for staying for this whole thing, and good luck with work. Enjoy work. In a time of pandemic, a time of crisis, a time of high anxiety, I think it's wonderful that we're being offered that as a team, to have a chance to do daily check-ins and daily support, because every day, as you know, information is coming at us at 1,000 miles an hour. Lots of information, lots of emails that we're having to read every day. We have to adjust what we do every day based on what's coming out from CDC. So there's a lot that's going on, in addition to the usual stresses and strains of doing this work, the real hard emotional work that we do every day. So that's another way that we're supporting each other. But yeah, I'm mindful that many professionals are really struggling, being on the front lines, and having to face death in that very immediate way. So I want to be mindful of those people as well, and we can support them as best as we can. If there's someone in your family who's a caregiver, who's a nurse or a doctor, just pray for them and support them as best as you can. So I know we're well over an hour here. I do want to just wrap up with a few thoughts. And death again is something that we cannot avoid. And sometimes it can be hard. We forget that we're still in Lent. So, and this is for, fellow Christians, people who are Christian, know that we're in the season of Lent. And this is, the fifth Sunday in Lent. And for Catholics, and I think for other Christian denominations, the reading today was about the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And I was participating in a live mass on the internet this morning, and the pastor preached about this and was really letting us know that Lazarus wasn't saved from dying, right? Lazarus died. Jesus didn't get a chance to get there in time before Lazarus died to perform some miracle, some healing miracle, right? We were told in the scriptures that he had been dead for 4 days. And Lazarus was not saved from dying, but he was saved from death. And so in this fifth Sunday of Lent, leading up to Easter, I know this is a tough time because we know that Easter will probably look very different than it has in past years. But the promise of Easter is that death is not the end, and that death itself is overcome. Dying, on the other hand, that's something that we all have to do, and that we all have to grapple with. And so how do we die with dignity? How do we die with a sense of peace? How do we die knowing that we did everything we could to give our families what they needed so that they could go through a painful grief experience without too much added burden? Most of the families that come to us, when I ask what their goals are, it's very simple. They want their loved ones to die at home in peace. They don't want their loved ones to suffer, either physically, emotionally, spiritually. And that's what we try to join them in that goal. We join them in that goal, and we try to help them achieve that goal. So my question to you is, what are your goals for your own dying process? Because it's going to happen. But it's okay, because you're not alone. We're all in this together. So how can we support each other? How can you make your needs known so that you die in the way that you would wish? So I want to end with reading a little passage that I bumped into not long ago, just a little while before starting this. Many of you know the name Martin Luther. Of course, we know Martin Luther King Jr., who is someone on my mind lately with everything that's been going on. But the other Martin Luther, the monk who lived in the I think 16th century, 15th, 16th century, who kicked off the Reformation, right? Martin Luther lived through, remember in the beginning of this broadcast, I was talking about the bubonic plague, the Black Death. that hit really hard in the 14th century, wiped out 50 to 60% of the populations. And then it had reoccurrences of that every so often, every couple of centuries or so. Well, Martin Luther lived through one of those. And I think he suffered personally. I think he had family members who were lost to this. And I came across a little passage, and people have been putting this on the internet a lot because, again, people are thinking a lot about how people dealt with the bubonic plague as we grapple with what we're dealing with now, dealing with death. And this is an excerpt from a letter that Martin Luther wrote to one of his friends and former Reverend Dr. John Hess about the question of this was the question they were grappling with, about whether they should flee from this deadly plague or whether they should stay and minister, knowing that if they did that, they would probably most certainly face death. And this is what Martin Luther wrote to his friend. I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus, perchance, inflict and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. So the wise Martin Luther tried to find that middle ground between being safe for himself and ministering to others at the same time. A very difficult task. And this is what many people are having to face right now. So obviously we have to follow guidelines, and we have to be safe. But whatever opportunities, whatever ways we have to help others and to be able to do that safely, we can take that opportunity. Again, for those on the front line who have no choice but to be close to people who are suffering and who may become infected themselves, we pray for their safety, and we pray that they have the equipment they need to protect themselves and their families as they care for others. But this is that middle ground that we must all find as we grapple with the real reality of becoming ill and potentially dying. And so how can we begin to open up, facing that reality, having more conversations about what we really want? So I pray that we may all live in this physical, emotional, and spiritual middle ground articulated so well by Martin Luther. And may we continue to do all we can to stay safe, but never refuse to help each other wherever we can, whenever we can, however we can, as safely as we can, trusting in God always, and with the grace, peace, and wisdom of God at our backs. Amen. That was a closing prayer, by the way. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you in the next broadcast. If you have any questions or thoughts you want to share with me, you can send me an email, Cylon, Cylon, at spirituallivingforbusypeople.com, Ceylon at spirituallivingforbusypeople.com. And I hope to see you again soon. Blessings. Stay safe. Bye, everyone.